my name is Jasmine Abney, and I'm talking about my research on the impact of COVID-19 discrimination among Asian American transgender communities. So, at the start of the pandemic, we saw a rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans, one example being the Atlanta spa murders, where 8 Asian Americans were killed. Another example was the targeted attacks against elderly Asian Americans in major cities such as LA and New York City. And this was due in fact to that Asians were being homogenized and seen as the cause of and carriers of COVID-19. And this idea was prevalent in part due to the xenophobic rhetoric coming out of the White House, where terms such as common flu and China virus were popularized in the media. And so we can really see a rise in hate with Asian Americans knowing someone who was negatively impacted during this time. And some important frameworks to really think about when looking at COVID-19 discrimination in Asian Americans is race-based traumatic stress theory and the model minority myth. So the race-based traumatic stress theory basically says that if someone has a direct encounter, like with discrimination or a racist encounter, they're then predisposed to psychological disorders such as anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. And so how this relates to COVID-19 discrimination is basically saying that these experiences of discrimination act as a trauma and contribute to the impacts we see, such as hypervigilance, fear, and anxiety. The model minority myth is defined as the assimilation of people of Asian descent into white-dominated society, and that really leads to the homogenization of this population and stereotypes. So, like Asian Americans being hard workers, being resilient, being successful in their jobs. And so how this relates to COVID-19 is basically when Asian Americans experience discrimination, they are expected to be fine and expected to move on. And so, while these previous frameworks have looked at Asian Americans as a whole and just understand discrimination and its effects, it's kind of left a gap of understanding of a subgroup of Asian Americans, which is Asian American transracial adoptees. And so that just really means that these Asians are basically placed into families that are not of the same race as them, and they are mostly adopted internationally, and they're mostly adopted into white families. And so we see this paradox play out called the transracial adoption paradox, which essentially is the idea that these adoptees are not seen as legitimate family or members of their family due to the difference of their race. And this can be perpetuated by their family members, by peers, and by strangers. And they're also not seen as legitimate members of their cultural community either, because they're not socialized to be a part of their cultural community. And so this really leaves these adoptees underprepared to cope with discrimination. And so that's why my research aims to understand how this group of people are affected by COVID-19 discrimination. So my current study, we had a couple goals. It was to understand the impact of COVID-19 on Asian American transracial adoptees, to understand its impact on their relationships with family and community, and to also amplify the experiences of Asian American transracial adoptees. And so for data collection, we conducted an IRB-approved study. We reached out to student organizations at UT and U of H. We also sent emails to Division 45, which is basically the Division of Race, Ethnicity, and Culture, and APA is Asian American Psychological Association. We were recruiting for participants who identified as Asian American transracial adoptees between the ages of 18 and 35 who were adopted either internationally or domestically, and our survey included open and closed-ended questions. So our participant pool, we had 7 Asian American transracial adoptees answer, all of them who identified as cisgender. The average age of these participants was 27, 6 of them being born in China, 1 being born in the United States with Vietnamese-born parents, 6 being adopted internationally, and 1 adopted domestically. So our data analysis, we did a thematic analysis, which basically says that we analyze our qualitative data to identify common themes, ideas, or topics that come up repeatedly. And we had 3 coders: a Chinese-born Asian American transracial adoptee, a Mexican American who was not adopted but had previous experience with Asian American transracial adoptee research, and a white American who was not adopted. And so for our measures, we had a coronavirus victim distress scale, and this scale basically looked at distress and racial bias. So for distress, it noted how distressed participants were with the amount of personal experience of being discriminated against, while the racial bias part of the scale looked at any stress they had in relation to potentially experiencing racial discrimination. And so for the distress part of our scale, the average answer was at like a 2.1 out of a 6-point scale, so they kind of fell into disagree. And then for our racial bias, their average was 4.1, again on a 6-point scale, which rated as somewhat agree. So our results for our qualitative data. Okay, so our research question, again, was how did COVID-19 impact Asian American transracial adoptees, with subset questions of how did that affect their relationships with their family and with their friends. So we had some major themes, three themes, which were factors that affected members of the community. So first we had racial discrimination, which we saw was basically the fear of experiencing racial discrimination and actually experiencing discrimination and how that led to feelings of anxiety. We had a theme that was safety, which looked at the increased awareness of one's adoption status and how that affected how they felt in their surroundings. And then this tied into how aware they were of their ethnic identity as well. And then we had relationships, which was the impact of COVID-19 on their relationships with friends and family. And we saw where there was a lack of empathy and understanding that manifested into invalidation and discrimination. So looking into racial discrimination, we had some sub-themes of socio-political climate, ethnic racial identity, othering, hate crimes, and discrimination. So this participant showed sub-themes of socio-political climate, othering, hate crimes, and discrimination. This participant describes feeling hyper-aware of how other people perceived them in public with their white adopted family. And this was a unique experience because they had never felt other. They had never felt distinctly Asian before COVID-19, but then during COVID-19, they felt other. They also did not feel safe. They felt anxious and scared in public due to their location and the rhetoric that they were seeing. So this participant really shows that there was a separation from the community that they had aligned themselves with. And this wasn't even like an internal separation, but they had noticed that externally people were separating them from their family. So this participant showed some themes of ethnic racial identity, othering, hate crimes, and discrimination. This participant's answer also highlights another unique experience of Asian American transracial adoptees during COVID-19 because they weren't only more aware of their Chinese heritage, but because they didn't personally experience discriminatory acts, they therefore questioned their validity of being a part of like a Chinese community or their heritage of being Chinese. And so again, we can see kind of a separation of this participant from their community. And so looking at the theme of safety, we also have the sub-themes of adoptive identity, difference from other Asians, isolation, microaggressions, racial difference from family, or no change. So this participant had sub-themes of adoptive identity, difference from other Asians, and microaggressions. We can see their unique experience. They basically felt more aware of their adoption status around other Asian Americans during COVID-19 because they couldn't personally connect with what their own fears were during this time. And their own experiences with discrimination were also invalidated by other Asian Americans based off of just the assumption that they were white because of their adopted name. And again, you can see the separation of not really finding community and a group of people that they thought they could find community in. This next participant had some themes of adoptive identity and racial difference from family. This participant had a really unique answer, and it really highlights the transracial adoption paradox at work. So much so that this participant didn't recognize that they physically presented as Asian American. In their mind, they were a part of their white American family, and so they really were confused when they had discriminatory acts targeted at them. They also couldn't recognize when someone was discriminating against them. And so this is, again, a great example of the transracial adoption paradox at play. And again, they were separated from the community that they had so strongly aligned themselves with. And then our last theme is relationships, which also had sub-themes of parent invalidation, ignorance, parent discrimination, and no change. So this participant had sub-themes of parent invalidation and discrimination. So you can see that there's invalidation and discrimination of their experiences with racial attacks. They communicated to their parent that they had experienced discrimination, and their parent invalidated that, and continued to invalidate that to other family members. And again, this is another example of the transracial adoption paradox, where the adoptee's cultural experiences are invalidated and denied by their parent, which caused a rift in the relationship between adoptee and family. Again, another separation from community. And then this participant had something of ignorance. They noted that their family members and white friends were silent during COVID-19, in a sense they didn't really check in or support them at this time, and they felt like they were forgotten as a person of color. They weren't acknowledged to be an Asian American and how that might affect them during COVID-19. And so again, this is another example of the transracial adoption paradox at play, because they were not seen as a legitimate member of their cultural community. And so some important takeaways. So COVID-19 discrimination exacerbated feelings of anxiety, fear, and hypervigilance in Asian American transracial adoptees, but then also just in Asian Americans in general. Our second point is that Asian American transracial adoptees had increased awareness of their adoption status. We found that their experiences of discrimination can't be considered homogenous to Asian Americans as a whole, or just based on their race, because of the intersectionality of their adoption status and race. So again, examples of this would be participant answers of being hyper-aware of their adoption status in public with their family, or being aware of their adoption status from other Asian Americans. And then our last bullet point, we saw that Asian American transracial adoptees grappled with their ethnic identities similarly to their non-adopted peers, but the effect of this appears elevated in Asian American transracial adoptees. And this can really be due in part to the model minority myth and the transracial adoption paradox. So previous literature has noted that COVID-19 discrimination can be felt tenfold in Asian Americans who have aligned themselves as an honorary white, and how this time with COVID-19 could feel extremely isolating due to the climate, creating a feeling of being distinctly Asian. And these feelings can be amplified because adoptees have been socialized to be white. So the explicit separation between themselves and their families can be even more isolating. And this goes hand in hand with the transracial adoption paradox, where we see a role of parent validation and racial differences. There's a lot of research that says that, because parents aren't recognizing their adoptees' experiences, or because they're not even acknowledging it or noticing discrimination as a whole, it leads to invalidation of these experiences, especially during high-stress situations such as COVID-19 and rising anti-Asian hate. So the adoptee has not only possibly lost a sense of belonging from their family, but also the greater white-dominated society, and this just elevates feelings of grappling with their ethnic identity. And you can see this again with one of our participant responses. They identified themselves heavily with their white American family, but they were confused and didn't understand how to grapple with their own ethnic identity. And so, limitations, a small sample size. It's really hard to get participants for like cultural psychology studies, and considering that the Asian American transracial adoptee population on St. Edward's campus is not that large, we had to really work hard to recruit outside of campus, and so that just brings its own difficulties. And so we also had a limited amount of time to analyze data because of this. We tried to keep our survey open as long as possible to get responses. And so we were really just crunching everything together. And so future research, I think we could identify more nuanced differences between Asian American and Asian American transracial experiences related to the model minority myth and COVID-19. Like I was talking about earlier, I think it just would be really interesting to have more research on this because it does heavily impact this subgroup. And then focus on subgroups like domestically adopted Asian American transracial adoptees' experiences with COVID-19 discrimination as well. So these are my references. And next slide. Thank you.
Presentation. I open it up for questions and comments.
So that was an awesome presentation. I love that you were able to zero in on a specific population in that way. I was wondering if in your research or other things you read, you ran across anything about where the population of Asian American transracial adoptees can receive support or did receive support, right? Because you mentioned that their families were less likely to share those experiences, right? And so it just be less likely to be able to provide that sort of direct support.
Yeah, so in the previous literature that I've read, it was really important for families to recognize that, okay, my adoptee is of a different race than me, and it really boils down to the socialization aspect of it, like really connecting your adoptee to the culture early on, teaching them things, connecting them to people that look like them, and it's unfortunate that I didn't go into that part of the research, but yeah, so that was a great way to kind of buffer the effects of being a transracial adult team. It's socialization. Yes.
So you mentioned in the beginning, whenever you're kind of setting the stage for the impact of COVID-19 and that leading to discrimination, like the use of inflammatory language, really following an event that people associated to a certain identity. It reminds me of like what happened after 9/11 and the association between essentially brown people, but more specifically Muslims. Anywhere in your literature did you come across any associations between, or did you draw from any literature referencing the events after 9/11, or did that not come up?
Honestly, that didn't really come up in the research or the articles that I was researching. I think that's a really interesting point that you made because it is extremely similar of just basically homogenizing a group of people because they, assuming that they're all the same because they look similar and things like that. But no, that didn't come up in my research. That's a really great point that you brought up.
I'm super interested in just the process of research and IRB and coding, and so just kind of any takeaways that you learned from going through that process that maybe you'll use in the future for other research.
Well, one big takeaway was that I really respect anyone that does research like this. IRB was a really, the whole process is, research methods really helped me here. But yeah, I think, I don't know, going forward, I don't really know if I have any takeaways because my future path doesn't include research, but I do really appreciate what I did learn doing this entire project and implementing things that I did learn in previous classes as members.
So you brought up, what is your future path?
My future path is I'm going to be a physician's assistant.
And invite Dr. Velez to the stage.
So I'm super proud of Jasmine. I also met Jasmine last year in my second pathology class. Struck me as very bright, very motivated, and one of the things that she alluded to, but I think it's very important to highlight, is that this took a lot of work. You're probably thinking like, oh, that's not that many participants, but it took a lot of behind-the-scenes work for her to get this and follow people up. And she's like, am I reaching out too much? No, just keep doing it, keep doing it. Very hard work, but very meaningful work. So very proud of you.